Hello, everyone. Wanted to do this little podcast, or I wanted to talk to everyone about something that I think many of us struggle with. This is going to be some of my concerns when it comes to anger, and I am going to share with you some things that you need to do in case you are with a partner or have a relationship with someone that where there's a lot of anger in the relationship. What do you do with anger? And I'm hoping to hopefully equip anyone that may be listening on this, and love to be able to share some of my thoughts on this. But yeah, so what do we do with anger? So anger is a very difficult emotion. It can feel very overwhelming at times. Anger is one of those things that when somebody is very flooded when it comes to anger, it could be sometimes actually kind of scary or even threatening. But anger, I would say, is one of those emotions that gets a bad rap often. And anger is one of those negative emotions that people will often experience or have with a lot of suspicion. And that's unfortunate because anger is not necessarily a bad emotion. In fact, there are many times that anger is a very proper emotion. If you don't feel angry over certain injustices, there might be something wrong. If you don't feel angry that somebody is flirting with your wife, okay, that might be something wrong. If somebody is attacking verbally or physically, threatening your child, and you don't feel angry, there might be something off. So anger often does get a bad rap, which is very unfortunate. I think we have this kind of view about anger that is kind of like, the old school Buddhist principle of somebody just kind of living on a mountain, never getting frustrated with anything. I don't take that approach. I take a very different approach. I actually think anger is an emotion that God has given us, that can be a wonderful emotion if used properly. But it's also an emotion that can often go out of hand or get out of hand. And so I want to talk to you a little bit if you are living with somebody or have somebody that often does get angry, and some of my clinical observations about that. So the way I define anger is that anger is just basically an emotion that we feel when we feel like we have lost control over something. When we feel like we're no longer in control, the typical response for some people is to get angry. It's often a very protective part. So rather than that person maybe, for example, getting very upset or sad or showing vulnerability, we will often be angry to maybe protect us from not being hurt. That's often how anger works. But often the way I just define anger is that anger is an emotion that I think people feel when they feel like something is out of the ordinary. Something that should be in the ordinary is no longer in the ordinary. It's a very proper emotion, as I just said, but it's also an emotion that I think is way too broad. I think a lot of people will go straight toward what they're feeling, which may be, quote, anger or angry. But it's anger is a very complex emotion, just like fear, just like feeling surprise, just like happiness, just like sadness, or even just like disgust. But as much as people are born and raised with 6 basic emotions, you have to break anger down. So as much as I don't take a negative view of anger, I will say that if all you're using when you're trying to describe what's going on inside of you is just, I'm angry, I think you're probably selling yourself short a little bit. So one of the things, if you're living with somebody or you yourself are experiencing a lot of anger, I would say, number one, it's sometimes it can be a very proper emotion. But if it's getting control over you, one of the main reasons why that could be the case is because you may not have broken it down in a very succinct way. So anger can be anywhere from feeling let down. It could be bitter. You could be mad. You could be aggressive. You could be frustrated. You could feel distant, or maybe you could feel critical. And if you break that down even more, jealousy is a form of anger. Feeling ridiculed can be a form of anger. Feeling disrespected, feeling betrayed, feeling provoked, maybe annoyed, or even numb, maybe even skeptical or dismissive. And as you notice, I keep trying to break that emotion down. Each coping skill that I may apply to both to myself or to my partner in those circumstances is going to be quite different than if I just said I'm angry. Because usually what people think of when they say anger, they feel somebody like just punching a hole in the wall or getting really mad or yelling. But, if you're feeling skeptical versus feeling betrayed versus maybe just feeling violated, or maybe just feeling provoked, or maybe even feeling really dismissed. Those are all going to basically need different types of coping skills, both from yourself and for your partner, to properly assess the emotion that you're feeling. So my first thing is, anger is not necessarily a bad emotion. But the second thing, if you feel like you're stuck in your anger, it could be that you haven't actually done the homework to know maybe what you're feeling. I noticed that there are a lot of men that often struggle with this. When I was starting my MFT program over 13 years ago, this is kind of a funny story. So I was at least I was kind of feeling prideful. I was feeling very, very prideful because I had just taken an exam by Dr. Andrew Hoffaker, and I aced the exam. I only missed one question. I got like a 99. I was feeling so prideful. I was feeling so kind of a little cocky. And I went and I go and sit in Dr. Richardson's class, and he gives us a feeling word test. And I was a former, I did a lot of environmental engineering. I minored in math. And at the time I had about 3 basic emotions, and that was anger, sad, or happy. And that was about it. And that's about my limitations if somebody asked me how I felt, that's pretty much where I would go. So Dr. Richardson gives me a feeling word test, and I fail it. And who fails a feeling word test? This guy right here. So I was your typical, though, on, man, I guess. I'm in my 40s now. When I was raised, I was basically just taught to have, basically certain emotions, that other emotions weren't necessarily cool. Other emotions were fine. So at a very early age, I was basically taught to be biased about my emotions. And I think a lot of men struggle with that even today. Women actually can struggle with this too. Women can be taught not to be angry because it can be seen as rude or maybe obnoxious, or maybe or unwomanlike. Men are often taught it's okay to be angry in certain situations, but you better be careful of it because you can be seen as violent. And while there's some truth to a lot of that, I think that's really the problem that we have with anger, is that we're hesitant to maybe know what the emotion is. And because of that, we're hesitant to maybe get into detail or to do the homework that we need to know what type of emotion that's part of anger that we're really feeling. Like I said, being annoyed is totally different than feeling numb or feeling dismissed, or maybe just not feeling, or maybe feeling betrayed. Okay, so it's really good that you do that proper work. It's a good emotion, but at the same time, it's much too broad. And so what I would say, to really get a control of your anger, try to be as specific as possible. The other thing too is that the best couples out there are really the ones who are emotionally intelligent. And what I mean by that is that they're aware of not just their positive emotions, surprise, happy, they're also aware of their negative emotions, which is disgust, sadness, anger. And so and also fear. And so happy couples are actually not biased about their emotions, in the sense that they don't just want to always look for happiness all the time or just surprise all the time. They actually invite in for, the feelings that person may be feeling in the relationship that happens to be negative. And we are born with 6 basic emotions, and 4 of those emotions, fear, anger, sadness, and disgust, are actually negative. Only 2 of the emotions that we're born with, surprise and joy, are actually considered positive. And so it really does some damage in the relationship if you are trying to suppress the negative emotions at the expense of the positive ones. What a good emotional couple will often do, or emotionally, which you want in order to increase your emotional intelligence, is that you actually want to invite those negative emotions in. Often anger will come out, or quote, explode, I guess, or just like people just like lose their lids or flip their lids. The reason for that, in most situations, really comes from the place of suppression, in the sense that, like, I'm not being able to release my sadness, or maybe my fear, or my vulnerability. And when we do that over time, for a very, very long period of time, all of a sudden that person will just flip out. I see this quite a bit in couples relationships. I mean, it's just the person's just trying to contain everything together. And all of a sudden they just lash out. You don't want to be there. You don't want to have that kind of relationship, either with yourself or with your partner. And one of the things that you really want to do is that you want to invite negative emotions as much as possible. And when I say negative emotions, I mean, being a person that is there for your partner who's feeling maybe frightened or overwhelmed, or maybe feeling insignificant or helpless or inadequate in some way. Maybe that person is feeling empty or inferior or disappointed. So you want to have a relationship where your partner can go to you feeling that way. And what I've noticed is that couples that have that type of emotional awareness and intelligence are often the ones that really don't struggle with that kind of rage that we so often think about when we think of anger. Now, if you and your couple are having a conversation and you're, you notice that just the other person just gets very defensive or angry whenever you bring something up. What I always tell people is try to ask yourself, do we have a good understanding of the difference between an actual criticism versus a considerate complaint? And what I've often noticed is a lot of couples don't actually know the difference between those two things. A lot of couples will confuse the two. So a criticism is really just any you statement, always statements, never statement. You're always so selfish. You never think of others. All you do is spend. You're so, all you do is buy, and all you do is care about everybody else, and you never care about me. That's an example of criticism, which actually is not helpful in a relationship. However, in this particular circumstance, people will often confuse a criticism with a considerate complaint, and they don't know the difference. And so I would just ask you, if you notice that there's a lot of anger in the relationship, do you all know the difference between the two? It's one thing to be angry when you're being criticized. In fact, it's kind of it's somewhat the proper emotion in some ways. If someone comes to you and says, you are always such a selfish jerk, you are going to feel somewhat violated, okay, or annoyed, or if you're going to feel at that moment angry, right? You're going to feel frustrated that you're being misrepresented. Because what about all the other times that you weren't a selfish jerk? Okay, and that's just where our emotions go. So if criticism, that actually makes sense where you would feel that way. However, if you're getting angry when your partner is coming to you with a very considerate complaint, like, hey, I thought you were going to text me at least 30 minutes before you came home last night prior to me making dinner. And I was really confused. And I just need you to at least text me 20 or 30 minutes ahead of time so I don't order out when I know that you're coming home. Okay. That's a considerate complaint. And if you're noticing that you're getting just as angry over here as you are over here, it could be two things. One, you're just a very defensive person, which it could be. The other thing is that maybe our relationship, we don't really know the difference between these two things. So it's really good to just sit down while the iron is cold, and just kind of say and ask, do we know the difference between an actual criticism versus a considerate complaint? And a lot of couples that I've found actually don't know the differences between those two things. They haven't actually talked about it. So it's very good that you do actually talk about that. The other thing too is that if you have talked about that, you know the difference between a criticism and a constructive complaint, and you're still seeing that the other person's getting very defensive, for example, then you have to set a rule there as well on who needs to take some responsibility. Because what I've noticed in relationships is that if the typical guy, he's getting really, really angry, and she will then start to kind of get hard on herself, thinking that I maybe should have said things a certain way so that he wouldn't get mad, or maybe should have been a lot nicer. And in those kind of relationships, I always encourage her or him, anger runs both sexes, both genders. I always tell them, you want to be mindful of not being over responsible for your partner. It's actually really key for anger. If you are over responsible for your partner, in other words, if you are feeling responsible when you're saying what you need to say in a very constructive way, and you're feeling like you have to walk on eggshells so that your message is nicer, you may be caught up in a relationship and a cycle that's actually kind of feeding an unhealthy dynamic between anger and responsiveness, or excuse me, passivity. And in that, you're really kind of caught up. And in order for you to kind of get unstuck, it's very, very good that you don't become over responsible for that person. So what I would encourage you to do is that if you feel, or excuse me, if somebody says a constructive complaint in the relationship and the other person then gets defensive, the rule is in all circumstances, defensiveness requires one anecdote only, and that is that person then has to take responsibility for themselves. And, I would encourage you to breathe a little bit about that. I mean, not too long ago, it was about 8 months ago, I sat in the sunroom, sitting down, and Bethany was asking me about something, and I just naturally became, I don't know what was going on. I just became really defensive. I did. Everything she was saying, I wasn't wanting to hear it. I was just like, I don't, and she noticed it. And she just kind of smiled because we both agreed that if whoever gets defensive, that person needs to take responsibility. So I got up and I took a shower, and I just realized while I was taking a shower, I saw 9 clients in a row, hadn't eaten lunch. My body was just getting very defensive in that moment. Didn't matter who was talking to me. So I came back in the sunroom and I just said to her, you know what? I'm sorry. I was getting really defensive and I just wasn't able to hear you. And she heard it. She was like, that's fine. Are you ready to hear me now? I was like, yeah, I am. And then we talked. So I'm not presenting myself like I'm so noble or anything, but that's a good relationship. That's a good dynamic of how a relationship really needs to work. I didn't blame her for my defensiveness. Well, if you shouldn't have said this to me in this, particular time, why didn't you know that? Or, why are you bringing up this, this, and this? If in that kind of dynamic, I'm blaming her as if she is responsible for my anger. Okay. And men do that, by the way. So women, don't let men get away with that. What you want to do is you want to not be responsible for your own stuff. Okay. And that just makes, in other words, we're going to have a relationship where it's okay to be human. All right. But if you do get defensive, you have to take responsibility for it. I'm not going to be responsible for you. Those relationships actually really thrive. And they allow for failure. It's just like that day. Hey, I just saw 9 clients in a row and I'm sorry. And I owned up to it. Didn't try to blame it on her. She's like, yeah, I've been there. Let's move on. And we did. That's a good relationship. So you want to take responsibility for yourself if you're getting defensive, especially if your partner hasn't done anything wrong. And guess what? That's okay, because we all have been there. All of us have been. And if you can have a relationship where it's built on a lot of trust, that makes that relationship even that much better, because now I get my partner. The other thing too, though, is that how are you saying things? I want to focus on this, is that how are you saying things? Because if you are so focused on making sure that you're not saying the wrong thing, or making sure I'm not saying something that would offend her or offend him, it could be that you're actually contributing to the message being kind of irritating. Okay. I often kind of say this to people, that anger actually dissipates when my partner can just focus on clarity and not be so worried about how it's coming across to me. I actually get irritated when people are trying so hard to not be offensive. I actually get kind of angry. I do. And I bet you do too, because it makes you kind of feel like you're a child a little bit. It does. And it almost like it's, it almost feels like the person is basically being infantile, in the sense like you're infantilizing you. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's just, it makes you feel like you're somewhat degraded, in other words. That's all. And so it's actually a lot better to just say to that person in the moment that I'm going to be focusing a lot more on my clarity than whether or not I'm saying the right thing or the how. So a good example of this. Okay. So let's pretend that I invite you to the party, or a party tomorrow night, and you end up being 10 minutes late. Now, I just want to ask you, what would you prefer? There's 2 scenarios. Okay. Hey, John, how are you? Hope you're doing okay. Oh, I like your outfit. Yeah. Anyway, so something, how are you? Yeah. I did want to bring something up to you, if that's okay. Yeah, yeah. Do you have a minute? Do you have a minute? Can I bring something up to you? I mean, would that be okay if I brought something? Are you sure? You sure you're not going to get offended? Yeah, well, it kind of bothered me that you were 15 minutes late, but I don't want you to worry about it. I mean, anyway, yeah, it definitely did, but no, I mean, not that bad, but anyway, yeah. So already, okay, let me stop. Aren't you getting more irritated? Yes, yes, you are. Who is this guy? Okay, that's scenario one. And guess what? You're going to probably get more and more irritated. And I often will see that with couples. Like she is trying to picture perfect her message, and he's like getting more agitated, or vice versa. Scenario two. Hey man, how you doing? Okay. Hey, I actually felt somewhat annoyed last night because I did need you to be on time last night, and if you could just tell me 5 minutes ahead of time that you're not going to be on time, that'd be awesome. Because I needed that at least last night because of the party, and I needed I at least needed the appetizers there. All right. Okay. Now the second one might be a little bit too blunt for some of you, but you know exactly where I'm at. All right. Maybe I could have used a little bit softer of a startup, but you also get the sense that I'm not like going to hold this grudge for the rest of my life. And in a sense, the second scenario is kind of freeing in a way, because I'm not really worried so much about how it's hurting your feelings. I'm going to be as clear as possible with you. And in a sense, I'm like, okay. Now, in those scenarios, you might get a little defensive. I understand that. But think about how you're coming across. I would tell all of you, focus more on clarity than trying to overthink on how my message is maybe being heard, because that's a lot of mind reading, and it's exhausting, not only for you, but also for your partner. When you focus on clarity, you might get a little pushback in the beginning, but it's so much healthier in relationships. And a lot of anger dissipates in those things. And finally, I should just say something about safety. Safety is really only an issue when you don't feel like you can do any of that, where your partner still does not feel that they're willing to take any type of responsibility in the relationship, or unwilling to get help. And all I could say to you in that kind of circumstance is that you still need to be very clear in your boundary, that you need to put the other person on the fence, or on the fire here, on what they need to do to resolve their issue. And for you not to take responsibility when it's their responsibility. And the reason why I say that is because, again, when I talk about in the very beginning, anger is really where we feel like we've lost control. When you give your own boundary and you state to the other person what you need to do and what he needs to do, or what she needs to do, in other words, you're refusing to feel guilty if they have an issue. And I'm not going to get caught up in gaslighting or emotional blackmail. I'm not doing that. That's something that you have to work on. And sometimes, this is the best approach to anger, because when you ask the other person to make a choice and not feel that they have no control, they sometimes have the control that they need to address the very issue that's hurting the relationship. So those are my thoughts on anger. And I have gotten some, quite a few people to, talk to me about that. And, what do you do in those circumstances? I hope you found this helpful, and love for you to offer any questions. Thanks.